Hello, and welcome back to my Rex's Wargaming channel. This is a re-upload of my Ottoman Army video. I wanted to do a better job on this one. In this video, I'm going to discuss a brief history of the Ottoman Army from 1875 to 1878. So it's going to cover the Russo-Turkish War, the First and Second Serbian-Ottoman Wars, the Herzegovinian Uprising, and the Montenegrin Ottoman Wars. And they'll go from 1875 to 1878. And the Montenegrin, Serbian, and Herzegovinian wars with the Ottomans, they will start in 1875 and 1876 with the Russo-Turkish War from 1877 to 1878. And I really want to discuss the character of the army. And when I was researching the army, and I was reading the Menning book, Bayonets Before Bullets, going into that, and the book actually discusses the development of the Russian Imperial Army, but it does have a good section where it's discussing the Ottoman Army and the challenges the Russian Army had, and it paints a very good picture of the Ottoman Army, which in this video I may call them Turks. The Russians call them Turks, even though they have Egyptians, they have a lot of people in their army that aren't Turks. But going into reading that, my impression was that the Ottoman Army was a bad army, and I thought this had poor troops and just everything was bad from the top to the bottom, and that's really not true at all. I mean, reading that really surprised me. That at the low level, the soldiers were very brave. I mean, they were skilled. They could be stubborn in defense, and even the command level, at company and battalion level, they're actually a very solid army. The Ottoman army really only falls apart once you get to the higher level, because they didn't really have staff colleges. A lot of the officers were not illiterate, but they didn't really have military literacy. They hadn't gone to schools or anything like that, military schools. And so while the Ottoman army, I would rate in this period as not the sum of its parts. It's the Ottoman army is less than the sum of its parts because they have good soldiers and they're very well equipped. But the poor leadership really takes the army down quite a bit. And so it creates an interesting situation for a tabletop wargamer. If you were playing the Ottoman army and you were playing it in, say, like a larger type of game where you're using divisions and corps like Black Powder, it would probably be a pretty bad army. But if you're playing a skirmish game like the Men Who Would Be Kings, which is what I really like to play and want to focus on in this video, it's actually going to be a pretty good army. It's really two different armies depending on the level. So at company level, they're pretty good. Anything higher than battalion, they're really bad. But I'd like to get into some of the reasons, historical reasons, why they're good. I'm going to get into that now. On June the 15th, 1877, the Russian army will cross the Danube at Nikopol, and that's preceded by a feigned crossing at Galatai. But at 1 o'clock in the morning on June 15th, the Russian army will cross the Danube at Nikopol, and that'll really be an effort done by the Russian 14th Infantry Division, which consists of the 53rd, 54th, 55th, and 56th regiments, the 4th Sharpshooter Brigade, a composite guards company, 2 detachments of dismounted Cossacks, 2 companies of sappers, 2 mountain batteries, the Don Cossack 23rd Regiment, a Ural Cossack Squadron, 4 pontoon battalions, a detachment of guard sailors. All told, that was 16 and 2/3 battalions, 6 Cossack squadrons, and 64 guns. Now, opposite the Russians, at the garrison there at Nikopol, on the upside side of the bank, were around 770 Turks, and they had about 2 guns with them. And about a mile away from them, there were another 3,000 Ottoman soldiers with guns. Now, when the Russians crossed, they crossed at night under the cover of darkness, but they were engaged. They didn't get across completely undetected, and the Turks were able to actually sink some of the pontoons. The Russians lost one of their guns in the crossing, but it was dark. There was confusion, and the Russian troops will immediately begin to kind of establish little pockets, defensive pockets, along the riverbank to kind of establish a beachhead for successive waves to cross. Now, in this confusion, there was not really a lot of higher level command on either the Ottoman side or the Russian side, and so the fighting early that morning in the dark, it really becomes a company level fight in lower. You have junior officers and NCOs on both sides leading detachments, and the Russian soldiers are trying to set up perimeters. They're gathering any men they can find, a lot of times from different units, as they're finding these men in the dark and just kind of stragglers and men who have been separated from units, and they're forming these little composite units and they're fighting, and the Ottomans are counterattacking ferociously. Uh, and the Russians describe it. It was absolutely brutal fighting, and it was said it was dark. Nobody knew where anybody was, and they were the only thing you're really going to see is muzzle flashes from the rifles. And it was very brutal fighting. It was hand to hand with bayonets and rifle butts and fists. But the Russians do prevail, and they're able to establish a perimeter, and more troops begin to land as it becomes daylight. Now, the Ottomans would have dislodged them probably with only 770 men had they been able to coordinate their attacks. And that's really where the Ottoman army falls apart, is the soldiers were, they fought very well, and they were fierce, and they're absolutely ferocious fighters, but they couldn't coordinate. And so the Russians do describe these attacks as piecemeal. And the units would get beaten back, and they'd regroup and counterattack. And multiple times in the night or in the early morning, they were counterattacking, but they could never quite get everybody coordinated at once. And the Russians were able to beat these efforts back, beat these counterattacks back. By the time by when the sun comes up, those 3,000 Ottoman troops, they arrive at the crossing site, and there are more Russian troops crossing, and the rifle fire was really so accurate from the Ottoman infantry that they're sweeping entire pontoons clean. They're killing or wounding every man on some of these pontoons that are crossing. The Russians are losing guns in the river and equipment in the river as they try to cross. But by the time daylight comes and enough men have crossed, and that they already have a kind of a beachhead, a perimeter established, the Ottomans aren't going to dislodge the Russians. Once they've crossed and got dug in, they're there, and the fighting really, by about noon, it's pretty much done. The Ottoman troops have been beaten there, and they retreat, and the Russians are able to cross everybody. And it's a very successful crossing, really. In 1877, to do a night operation and cross like that, there's no radios, there's no night fighting equipment, and a lot of the efforts being, as I said before, led by NCOs and junior company level officers. They were really the ones that kind of saved that landing. When they were getting fired on, that they were the ones that established that perimeter. But the Ottoman soldiers, the account describes them as they fought incredibly well. And so I want to go next to the battles at Plevna. Now, I'm not going to go through each individual battle of Plevna, or sometimes I read it as Plevin, so Plevna or Plevin, whatever you want to use. I'm not going to go into each of the individual battles. There are 4 battles. Really, the important ones to discuss are 3, and then the fighting on the Sofia Road. And so the first 3 battles of Plevna, the Ottomans are defending the town. They're dug in, and it's the Russians, predominantly the Russians, and I believe some Romanians are involved, and they're trying to take the town. But the Ottoman troops are dug in, and when the Russians attack them, they a lot of times they actually do get to the earthworks. But the Ottoman troops, as I said again, they're ferocious. They're very tough fighters, and so when they get there, even when they have a breakthrough, they're able to counterattack, and they're able to plug the gaps. And so the first 3 battles of Plevna, they're a complete disaster for the Russian Imperial Army. They don't really make any headway. They're no closer after the 3rd battle than they were the first of taking Plevna. And what they'll end up doing is they'll actually move to cut off the Ottoman supply lines along the Sofia Road. And there are a number of fortifications along the Sofia Road that they have to take to cut off the supply lines. And it provides another good opportunity for skirmish gaming. During one of the forts, when they're taking one of the forts, it's actually being attacked by Russian troops, some of which are guard regiments, because after the 3rd battle of Plevna, they bring in some of the guards, some with the guards division, because they're pretty good troops. And they're fighting Ottomans, and the Ottomans put down incredibly effective rifle fire. I mean, their rifle fire is very accurate. And they kill a lot of officers, and they kind of stall this Russian attack at a fort. I forget which fort it is. I should reference my book. I'll do that now. That was at the Battle of Gorny Dubnik, and it's the Moscow Guards Regiment. And they lose about 1,000 men, a little over 1,000 men taking that fort. The Ottomans lose 1,500 defending it, but the troops were actually pinned down about 1,000 meters from the fort, and the individual soldiers, sometimes led by NCOs, sometimes small groups of men who were just privates, started moving forward, crawling forward, with no real coordination. No one told them to do this. They were just tired of getting shot at. They couldn't retreat. They were going to get shot at if they went back anyway, so they just crawl forward. And that's very reminiscent of kind of modern warfare. You wouldn't think that in the 1870s, but these small groups of Russian grenadiers, these guard grenadiers, they start moving forward. And then they get to the point where they threaten the Turkish fort, and the Ottoman officers sort of decide to surrender because he knows if he fights on, he's going to lose more men for nothing. And so they surrender, but The Ottoman troops up to that point, they had really, pushed back an entire guards division. It's only by the effort of some of those guards that they do end up taking it. But they're incredibly effective fighters, and really the fourth battle of Plevna is a breakout attempt by the Ottomans, and it doesn't go well, and they surrender, and they surrender the defenses because they're starving. The campaign, the offensive on the Sofia Road that cut off the supply lines worked. It was a good idea. And that's just, reading that and reading all this, there's things I didn't know about the Ottoman army. I thought it was a bad army, but when I read these accounts, I realized, well, the army was not really great, and at the higher levels, they had a lot of rife with issues, a lot of inefficiency, and just lack of coordination between different elements. The individual soldier, it was not his fault that war went the way it did. He fought incredibly well, ferociously, and the army was actually pretty well equipped. And so I said, if you're playing this army in a skirmish game, like the Men Who Would Be Kings or Rebels and whatever skirmish game you want to use, I like using the Men Who Would Be Kings for everything because I know the rule set, and so I'll adapt it to whatever. But it really is a different army than if you're playing it in something like Black Powder, because a skirmish Ottoman army will be a very good army and an interesting army to do. And so I'm going to get into that. I'm going to talk about sort of the composition of where these people would have come from, and then do the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery. I'll touch a little bit on sailors, and then Bashi Bazooks, who we all think are kind of cool. They're a really interesting troop type, especially for a skirmish game. Now, the Ottoman army at this time was actually pretty similar to a lot of other armies in large empires. The troops were in units that were from the same area, so you'll see men described as being Egyptian troops or Turkish, or being from wherever they're from, because they do have different languages in the empire. Now, with the Ottoman army, what we're going to be broadly talking about is regular troops and reservists. Now, since they had troubles in the Balkans with the Herzegovina uprising and the Montenegrin and Serbian wars, a lot of these reservists had been on active service since 1875 or 1876. So by the time of the Russo-Turkish War, they've been on active service for a year, 2 years, roughly, and they're going to be pretty good troops. They're going to have a lot of experience, and just being in active service makes soldiers better because they're drilling regularly. They're subject to army discipline, and so if I were going to rate them for a game of the Men Who Would Be Kings, I would not rate them any different than regulars. I would just use them all as the same type of troops, and I would actually rate them as regular troops. According to the book entry, no modifiers, positive or negative. I know I said they were fierce before, and I do consider them to be fierce, but the only way you're going to get like the actual fierce rating, at least for me, is you have to be like Gurkha fierce. But they are good soldiers, and so I would rate them as regular, no modifiers. The arms were quite good. The main rifle of the Ottoman army was the Peabody Martini rifle, and so it's very similar in operation to the Martini Henry. It's a very good rifle. A lot of the reservists also had Snyder Enfields, and they actually had Snyder Springfields, which are just Snyder conversions on Springfield rifle muskets. A lot of those rifle muskets were available after the American Civil War. They were purchased on the market cheap. I'm not sure if the Ottomans did the Snyder conversions or they were done in Belgium. I've read both. Either way, it's going to function just like a Snyder Enfield. There's no real functional difference between either. For any troops equipped with Snyder Springfields, Snyder Enfields, or Peabody Martinis, I would rate them the exact same, basically armed with the same rifles, because the Peabody Martini, while more efficient breech loader than a Snyder Enfield or a Snyder Springfield, is not that much better that you'd rate the troops differently. And these two irregulars here are actually armed with the Snyder Springfield conversions. Now, the rifles that you would rate the troops differently would be if they were armed with Winchester lever actions, and the Ottoman Empire at this point had purchased a lot of Winchester lever action rifles and carbines. And this rifle is actually what is known as a musket configuration, so it took a bayonet. They purchased both Winchester 1866 muskets and 1873 muskets, or 44 caliber. They don't have the best range compared to something like a Snyder or a Peabody, but they can produce a massive volume of fire. And so any troops I had that were armed with Winchesters, I'd rate them as sharpshooters, not that they're any more accurate or better shots, but just to represent that massive volume of fire. That volume of fire advantage would actually be pretty cool in a skirmish game. It might make the difference in the small level warfare. They certainly helped out in the larger battles, but it wasn't enough to make or break at any battle. Small arms very rarely do that. Now, if I were going to rate the Ottoman cavalry, I would rate them as just regular cavalry. They also had guards cavalry, which are the men in the red jackets. So I may rate them a little bit better, give them elite or something. They had lancers for some of their cavalry. Some were just traditional saber armed troops. In addition to the lances and sabers, a number of the cavalry were also armed with Winchester lever-action carbines, both model 1866s and 1873s. To represent these men, I would probably just use them as mounted rifles, so I can actually represent that volume of fire, which isn't really possible in the entry for cavalry. Following on this is the artillery. The artillery was a fairly modern branch in the Ottoman Empire, and they were armed very heavily with Krupp guns. So, model C-64s, C-67s, C-73s. Most of their Krupp guns, I believe, were actually on iron carriages or steel carriages. Even the export C-64s were on iron carriages. And as far as I understand it, the artillery arm itself was quite professional. The Ottomans did continue to use some muzzle-loading, smoothbore, bronze, and iron guns, but by the time of the Russo-Turkish War, those guns were really confined to fortifications, static positions, that sort of thing. As far as how the Ottoman Navy operated on the land, I really don't know. I haven't found much information on that. They would have certainly helped out in river crossings as the Russian Imperial Navy would send detachments to help men cross rivers. I'm not really sure how they functioned. Now, the interesting part of the army is really going to be the Bashi bazooks. That's going to give you a lot of variety, and it's not as clear really how you'd want to rate them. I have a few ideas, but really getting into it, the Bashi bazooks were irregular troops. They were really drawn from all over the empire. They came from a variety of ethnic groups. Their weaponry varied a lot, from flintlock muzzle-loading, rifles, muskets, very long barrel pistols. Some would have revolvers, very modern revolvers like Gasser revolvers and Colts. Smith and Wesson number threes and Russian models, which were not just captured from the Russians; they were actually available on the commercial market. A lot of knives, very long knives and swords. Some Bashi bazooks fought as cavalry, others as infantry. They weren't paid. That's another thing. They just kind of joined the army and they fought for loot and plunder. But the Bashi bazooks they're a holdover of an earlier time. They're almost medieval in the idea of these random irregulars who just join an army. They're unpaid. They're not really structured. They don't fall under commanders. I mean, they'll sometimes they'll work with the regular army, but they can go off and do their own thing. They don't really answer to anybody. They fight for their own reasons, which is oftentimes they're pillaging, they're raping, they're plundering, they're burning. They're really in it for themselves. They do sometimes fight incredibly bravely in ways that you wouldn't think, but oftentimes they're not really going to stand up to real troops. They're not looking for a pitched battle with real Russian troops or anybody like that. They're looking to attack a village, and they're looking to raid and rape and pillage and steal what they can, carry off what they can. They are useful in small war, so those sort of activities that they're good at, I mean, they can be used in. But Ottoman commanders will oftentimes find them a hindrance because if you're moving a real army through and you're trying to lay siege to something, you're going to scour the countryside and bring in resources, livestock, food. While the Bashi bazooks if they're burning fields and they're taking food and they're taking plunder, they can really hinder how the army functions. But you're going to see these are some of the revolvers that the higher end Bashi bazooks would have had, like Gasser revolvers and Smith and Wessons. But a lot of times they just had a flintlock pistol, like you see here, tucked into a sash, with a very long knife or two or three. But you could rate them as fierce troops, or in different ways. You could also rate them as kind of unwilling, because when the going gets tough, the Bashi bazooks get going. They're not sticking around, and they're fighting for very practical reasons. And they're not like regular Ottoman troops that are going to stick it out and fight and counterattack until they're dead. Bashi bazooks don't fight that way. Like, as I said, their arms varied quite a bit, and so you could use Bashi bazooks as irregular infantry. You could use them as irregular cavalry, mounted rifles. Their weapons would run the gamut from bladed weapons to percussion revolvers like these here, to cartridge-firing revolvers, Winchester lever actions, flintlock muskets. And so if you want to use mounted rifles, for instance, or men with like Winchesters, you may give them antiquated muskets, to represent the short range, but also sharpshooters to represent the volume of fire. Now, the important thing to keep in mind, especially if you're going to use Bashi bazooks, is that they're not really going to be a good unit in your army. They're not going to be a good unit in anybody's army, but they add flavor to the army, and they're at best, the best uses as a supplemental unit. You don't want to create an entire army of Bashi bazooks. You probably won't win a lot of battles because they're not stand-up fighters like the regular Ottoman soldier is going to be. But they add flavor and they're fun, and they can vary so wildly in how you'd rate them because they weren't very uniform, and some units were a lot better than others, and some units were armed better than others. And so that's something to keep in mind about the Bashi bazooks. But overall, this is some of the ideas I had when I was actually reading this book on the Russian army and the Ottomans. I was very surprised with the stuff I read about it, and I did some research in other places. But I think they'd be really interesting for wargaming. You could have a lot of fun with them. And Outpost Miniatures does make a line of miniatures for the Russo-Turkish War. Badger Games sells them. A lot of the stuff is out of stock now, but you can probably get at least a small core. They don't. The problem is their sculpts don't necessarily mix well with other people, so you may actually want to get Perry Egyptians and paint them as Ottomans. And actually, Perry has Bashi bazooks in that line too, so that would work just fine. If you want to do Perry, I think Perry's probably a better sustainable option anyways because they're still making them. But that is my video, and this was actually a re-upload, like I said before. If you like it, hey, please share it with people you think would like it. Give me a thumbs up and a comment. I mean, really, I like to improve. So anything you'd like to see or you think I got wrong, please tell me in the comments. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.